Well, welcome everybody. It is now 7:01, so let's go ahead and get started. We are recording this webinar, and it will be available on the University of Michigan Press YouTube site. We'll give you that information at the end. My name is Elizabeth Demers, and I'm the editorial director at University of Michigan Press. And it's my great pleasure to work with the three series editors we have with us tonight, and I'm excited to introduce them. Our first series editor is Jay Parini, who is a poet, novelist, biographer, and critic, and longtime professor at Middlebury College. He's published over 30 books, and he's the editor of Writers on Writing. In addition to serving in his role at the press as the editor for Poets on Poetry, Derek Pollard is a widely published poet and book critic, longtime educator and workshop leader, and founder of Constellar Creative, a creative agency specializing in content marketing and copywriting. Georgia Popoff from Syracuse, New York, is the YMCA of CNY's Downtown Writers Center Workshops coordinator and faculty member, editor and book coach, former Comstock Review editor, and the series editor for Under Discussion series at University of Michigan Press. Her most recent poetry collection is Psychometry, published by Tiger Bark Press in 2019, and she was recently named Poet Laureate of Onondaga County, New York. And for more information, please visit her website at georgiapopoff.com. Welcome. Thank you so much for being here tonight. Okay, so I know we have already some questions in from the audience, and I know we are all excited to talk about writing and reading and poetry and so forth. So let me kick us off. You are all writers, and you are all teachers of writing. And so I'm interested to know why we care what poets and writers have to say about poets and writing. In other words, what makes these three series special and compelling, both for writers and readers?
Well, shall I kick it off, Elizabeth?
Please.
It's funny. I think it's this kind of writing that we're publishing in these series has become even more important over the last couple of decades. I was always mostly interested in what, say, poets had to say about poetry and novelists had to say about writing fiction, because they're doing the nitty gritty. They're working on this stuff. They know what the problems are. They know what the landscape looks like. They know what it takes to get a poem on the page, to get a novel or a story written. And so they have the news that I want to hear. And just when you look at the history of criticism, I mean, the books that I much preferred would be, say, D.H. Lawrence writing about even American literature, or W.H. Auden, his wonderful book of essays, writing about detective novels. Whatever Auden wrote about was just tremendously interesting. The greatest critic of the 20th century is probably T.S. Eliot. And, he was a philosopher and a critic of huge stature. And he reshaped how we think about modern literature, mostly in poetry, but in everything. So the writers who wrote essays about literature were always the ones that interested me. But then you've had this curious thing. I've been teaching now for 50 some years, and I have gradually seen literary criticism move away from writers and be more written by theorists of literature, people not interested in the nitty gritty of literature. So if you read the literary criticism of the last 20, 30 years, increasingly it's written in a kind of, I don't want to just disparage it. It has its own market, but it's not my market. It's not a market that interests me. I mean, I'll just say, frankly, I can't read that stuff. It's full of jargon. It's boring to me. While it may bring some interesting thoughts to bear on the page, and I'm sure it does frequently, it's of zero interest to me as a writer. I never learn anything from it. And I kind of long for the days when I would go when I first started teaching at Dartmouth College in New Hampshire, every day I'd walk up to a diner and have coffee, and I'd cross the street and there was a bookstore, and I'd go straight to the literary criticism section. And there was always something interesting to read 50 years ago. I mean, I couldn't believe it. There was always something. But nowadays, who would dream of walking into a bookstore nowadays and go straight to the literary criticism section? I mean, not unless you're really an insomniac and you need to get to sleep and you don't want to take Valium. I really think that we provide in these series and series like this, it's going to be I think the criticism of the future will be essays written by writers about writing, and who have an understanding, a deep understanding of language, who write beautifully, who are, suffering at the desk every day trying to make poems, make stories, make essays. And I think this is the kind of writing that people are going to want to read down the road who are interested in literature. I'll just leave it there for the moment.
I want to jump on that, Jay, because you're reading my mind. Books that are lit crit with 5-syllable words and extensively long sentences to say a thing you could say in 3 words get on my nerves. I want the emotional response, possibly. So I'd much rather read something like Richard Hugo's The Triggering Town or Mary Ruefle's Madness, Rack and Honey than try to get through Charles Olson once again. Like, just try to get through it. I can't get through it. I can't get through it. It's too much in the head. And I've been outside of academia and working in community for most of my career. So I like real simple language. I like things to be given to me in things that I can break down in ordinary but well-crafted language, because a book about writing has to be written well. And some of them are written really beautifully. And when it's written really beautifully, not only do I learn, but I also watch how it's written. I learn more about the craft, but I also, how do I write about writing? How do I then teach about writing in a way that gets through to people? Because there's a lot of people who aren't in higher education who love to write. And we want to help them. We want to give people, anyone who wants to write, an opportunity to have tools to strengthen their own sense of what you can do with language. How can you communicate? How can you build a bridge from hearts and minds to your reader? And what happens when you actually start writing with a reader intended? A lot of people who write because they love it, but not necessarily because they're going to publish. That it's a big step to say, oh, I'm writing for myself. But then when you have to include a reader into the experience, you have so much more work you get to do. And when books get to show you how to bridge that gap from what I presume in my head I know that you don't know yet. So I kind of like books about writing that are more like lyric essays in a way.
Well, and Georgia, to continue that thought, I can't help but think, and Jay, this touches upon one of the points that you raised earlier. I can't help but think of a writer who has created a body of work that rests in the spaces between genre and between these categories, these distinctions that we make between creative writing and critical writing. Someone like Susan Howe, who's My Emily Dickinson or The Birthmark, occupy that space and elevate criticism, Jay, as you were saying before, to an art form, and give us the opportunity to experience not just a writer's thinking, and Georgia, this kind of touches upon your point, not just a writer's thinking about the art of writing, but actually immersing us in the experience of creative activity. And that to me is one of the greatest rewards that literature and the arts provide for us, that immersive experience in which our own creativity, however close to it or far from it we may be in our lives at that moment, books like the books that we have the opportunity to bring into print kindle that spark, reward that type of deep thinking, give us the opportunity to create these lasting conversations. I mean, Jay, you almost got us there, but when Ezra Pound says that poetry is news that stays news, seems like he'd kind of created promo copy for each of these 3 series without realizing it, because in the conversations that I have been having with prospective authors and authors we have the good fortune now to be working with, to a person, they've talked about the importance of books in these series to their own craft, but also to their own coming of age as a writer. And I find that to be extraordinary, and it's a tremendous honor to be part of that process now, because to a person, every single interaction that I've had when I've mentioned poets on poetry or under discussion or writers on writing, people have begun to list the titles that are on their bookshelves. And that's not true of a lot of series. And I think that it's true of these series precisely because not only are they timely, but they continue to tease at these conversations. They continue to give us the opportunity to reframe the dialogue of the moment and to look at things from new perspectives and new lenses. And I find that to be extraordinary. And certainly in my experience as a writer and as a reader, I'm in the same boat. I mean, if you look closely, you're going to see some of the titles on the bookshelves here. They've been instrumental to me. And I think that that's one of the great services that the press and these series provide readers and writers, and people who might not identify as creative people, the opportunity to be reminded of that.
Oh, you just hit on, I'm sorry, Elizabeth.
No,
but
go
you
ahead,
just
George.
hit on a key word, which is service. You know, a lot of the conversations that I've had, I'm fairly new to the press. This is not quite a year now. And I considered it not only an honor, but an opportunity to be of service to the writing community. And when I'm talking with people about, the potential of doing a project with us, it's like I can be of service to the press and to the community at large by identifying books that will be of value to writers and readers, and to broaden that conversation. It's a tremendous opportunity to give voice to things that need to be said for other writers, and for them to, but also for other readers. I mean, there are a lot of people who like to read about poets, or who like to read about, how do you do that anyway, even though they don't do it. I have a dear friend who's a good friend to the Downtown Writers Center, who's an engineer, and almost every time she goes to a poetry reading, somebody comes up and says, are you a writer? And she'll say no. Well, which isn't true, because she writes science stuff, but she's not a creative writer. And they say, well, why are you here? And she says, because I like poetry and I like literature. Like, we don't just write for ourselves. We're not necessarily writing just for people who write what we write and read what we read, And I think that if we have a series like this, that's such accessible ways of looking at the craft of writing, more people might read differently. When they're reading creatively, they might look at what some of the people who take classes with me, once they start reading and saying, I read that book more like a writer than a reader, and I learned an awful lot. Like, yeah, that's how we learn. Miriam Sagan has a great book called The Unbroken Line, and her premise is that writers learn in an apprenticeship manner similar to the fine crafts. You learn it from other writers.
So as an editor who works with writers, it's been an absolute pleasure to work on these 3 series with all of you. And one of the things I think that separates the books in these series from some of the classic writers' manuals, such as like Stephen King's On Writing, or Anne Lamott's Bird by Bird, or Annie Dillard's Pilgrim at Tinker's Creek, is that these books are really about coming of age as a writer in reading, and thinking about how reading shapes you as a writer, and they connect themselves to this greater world of reading. And so 2 specific examples that I can think of are Robert Cohen's Going to the Tigers. The whole book is great, but he's got a wonderful chapter about how to name characters. And he starts with thinking about his own name, and how as a young man, as an adolescent, he renamed himself several times and tried to get other people to rename him as well. And how we do that. Jane Miller's book, Valley of the Bronze Camels, inspired me so much. I actually sat down and wrote a poem about my pajamas, right? It's never going to be published. I'm never going to show it, but I was so excited to read, to share the reading journeys that these writers had, and to think about how they structure choices that writers make through the essays that they've written. And I wonder if you could talk about that a little bit, this connection between reading and writing, and thinking through some of these problems in the essays in these books.
I found that I had a lot of the original reading Cohen and reading Miller here, the two books in my series. I felt like I was back starting again as a writer and really enjoying seeing how writers stumble upon other great writers and learn from them. I think of myself as a kid wandering into the library as an 18 or 20-year-old and, reading Joan Didion and reading, Susan Sontag and reading Adrienne Rich, and just being so excited about what they were saying about the people they were reading and how they were thinking. And, I think the books that I'm looking for this series, and the ones we found so far, are just about these very kind of things. What excites you? What Cohen goes on a journey in the footsteps of D.H. Lawrence in Sardinia in one of his essays. And that's a thrilling essay. Or he's chasing after Kafka, the writers who meant so much to him when he was starting off. And you see where the inspiration came from for him as a writer of fiction. So this is the kind of thing I'm looking for. And we're discovering in these series, we're finding the new work. We're finding the new Joan Didions, the new Susan Sontags, the new Gore Vidals, the new Norman Mailers. Remember how important in the 60s it was to read Mailer's Advertisements for Myself. I mean, that was such a profound book at the time. So this is what the life of the mind is all about.
Well, and it also gives us an opportunity to operate in a spirit of generosity. I keep thinking about another book that we have that we're moving toward production in the Poets on Poetry series by Khadijah Queen, that I'm absolutely thrilled about. The premise of which is bringing not only a greater sense of generosity, but a lovingness to the work that we do as critics, as writers, as artists. It doesn't paste over the well-founded outrage, sense of demoralization that we might experience. It doesn't attempt to redirect our attention, but what it does do is it gives us permission to be more decent in our relationship to the work that we do, the work that we encounter, the other voices that we engage with. And I find it to be a fascinating principle and a guiding principle for both the press and for each of these three series. That generosity provides a foundation, and we mentioned building bridges. It expands the foundation upon which we're operating and sets in motion a dialogue that will continue to go on after the book has been put down. And I think that that's one of the things that the books in these series have always done and are increasingly doing, and are increasingly doing it in different ways by inviting more voices into those conversations and exploring some of, again, the most timely and at the same time timeless conflicts, some of the most deeply felt experiences. In Major Jackson's most recent book, A Beat Beyond, this is in the chapter entitled A Mystifying Silence, Big and Black. He writes at the very end, and this is an essay that was originally published in 2007, writing about race has to be so much more than writing about race. And moreover, race in poetry is not a mere discussion between Black and white peoples of the United States, or a visit to the Martin Luther King Jr. National Historic Site, or some poeticized contraption set up to ensnare an overly sensitive group of readers who passionately believe in equity, justice, racial harmony, and change. It bears repeating again for us to actualize as a country whose ideals and documents profess the value of a diverse ethnic and racial populace. We must begin to pen a body of poems that go beyond our fears and surface projections of each other to a fuller account of the challenges and reaches of an ever-evolving democracy. Having an opportunity to work with authors who are making statements that resonate that deeply and that will continue to resonate as we carry forward this wobbly American project and all of its proliferating ways is an extraordinary opportunity, not just for us to be able to publish books in these series, but to invite and also to listen and hear the conversations that are sparked by reflections that are that profound, impactful, and lasting. And this is true for every book in each of these three series, right? There are moments throughout all of them. Elizabeth, you'd mentioned a couple. Jay, I know you'd mentioned a couple. Georgia, your turn is next, right? But all of these books have these sparks in them that give us the opportunity to enter into dialogue in constructive, creative ways. And I don't think it bears underscoring that ain't happening everywhere else right now.
Yeah, I kind of would like to cast my vision forward. And so we've got a 40-year history of these seminal books. And how do we keep it moving forward and relevant and bringing attention back to what's already been published, but give voice to new? And when offered to join the team, my thought was, I'm looking for people to bring forth the books about people that they haven't been written yet and should have been. And how is that, how is that representative of a greater diversity of writer? And who's been overlooked for a really long time while other people were being written about, but are still very critical to American letters? And having those conversations with people, like, who do you think there should be a book about? Who's an Indigenous writer that there's not a book out there, but they've been important for 50 years? Who's an Asian American writer, or any form of diversity that hasn't been represented in the world as well as it should be? And any poets, especially I'm looking at elders who might still be able to be involved in the conversations about their work. That's exciting.
There's an example in Major Jackson's book about that, where he goes to a poetry reading and he does not know who the poet is. And he's like, well, he had a vision of what poetry should be, and this person didn't fit into it. And he ended up falling in love with the poems and asked the poet to be his mentor, even though he'd been working in a completely different kind of poetry and had a different aesthetic belief system. And I think that's one of the things that Georgia, you're talking about in terms of what this series can do, is to be that, that poet, that writer. Right.
Who do you not know that you don't know yet, too?
Right.
Trust us. We know.
Let me ask you a practical question for all the writers who are with us today. And please, everyone, make sure you put your questions in the Q&A so that we can answer them shortly. But these books talk about, as I said, reading extensively, and talk about how to form yourself as a writer through the reading that you do and the thinking that you do, and how you expand your horizons. How can writers use these books in their own work? And how can you, as teachers of writing, what advice would you give for people who are looking to these books to work on their own writing skills or aesthetic?
Well, these books provide a kind of map of reading for the most part. And so I think that's what young writers and people begin starting in workshops, but they might not even be young. But writing begins with good reading. Good writing and good reading are so closely affiliated. They're almost the same thing. And so you can't possibly become a good writer without becoming a good reader. And so what do you read? How do you read? What does it mean to read well? These books are asking these questions over and over again. And I think they're mapping out directions for people's work. So I think this is how you begin. You read some of these books we're publishing. You see what writers mean a lot. Say Robert Cohen talks about how much Kafka meant to him. Well, that's the place to start, because someone sees how you're influenced by a writer. I mean, every writer begins by imitating other writers. There's no opportunity to go any other way. You begin as an imitator, and then you gradually assume your own contours, your own texture. You find your own voice. You move in directions that have, a personal feeling about them. But you begin by looking around you and saying, how do I write? Who do I imitate? That's where we start.
And we're led by our enthusiasm, right? I think that's one of the other things that has always attracted me to books in these series is each of these writers in their own way shares with us. In Elizabeth, you could see that the way in which Jane and
Just lost your sound.
me.
Oh,
we're
there you're
back.
back again.
We're back. Okay, good. By sharing our enthusiasm, right? And being able to participate in that. Again, this is, Jay, as you're saying, not just a journey that's being mapped out. And I love the fact that the word was plural, directions, plural. It's also an opportunity to find your company as you go and to begin to enter into dialogue with the writers who are going to shape your own poetics, your own approach, your own understanding of what it means to be a writer, and to see that modeled for you in interesting and pleasurable ways, in ways that call into question some of our deepest held beliefs and affirm us in our passions and in our desire to continue to be creative in our lives. I think these books are deeply, deeply rewarding. And again, you're going to find, because historically and certainly moving forward, such a proliferation of voices and perspectives, you're going to be hard pressed not to begin to find your company and find the writers, if you are apprenticing yourself in that way, that you want to follow. And Georgia, as you had said earlier, the writers that you don't even know you need to know yet, they're here already. And we are continuing to listen as people bring projects, as people point us to writers that may have been overlooked, or who may be emerging, or who may be working outside of some of the more conventional environments. We have an opportunity right now to spark those conversations and share those enthusiasms, and to continue to provide those opportunities for people. It really is thrilling. And again, Elizabeth, we could see, I think that I might have broken up. We could see when you were relating your experience in reading Jane's book, the excitement it brought, right? Not a lot of books are capable of doing that. And I think that also speaks to the question you had asked earlier. Why writers on writing? What's so interesting about that? Why not just the poems? Why not the stories? Why not the screenplays? Well, because we're curious, because there's so much more happening in that experience of writing that we have an opportunity to get a window into. And I think that's also really interesting.
I'd like to add to it. There's a mythology about what it takes to be a writer. Like we're up in the garret with the, little coal stove and all alone with our scarf around our head, slaving over our work. And it comes out perfectly. A lot of people think that it's easy for writers who identify as writers and are publishing. And, the fact is it's work, but it's joyous work. And there's a lot of books out there in the trade market of how to write a novel and, or November, write a novel in a month. Like, oh, come on, all this mythology around what it takes, and that it's formulaic. And what our books show is, no, it's organic. It's something, it's organic, and it's work, and it's the first draft is only the draft. I've been on a mission to take that sentence that I hear over and over, or that phrase, a shitty first draft, right. No, I'm never, ever, ever going to give my first draft a negative connotation in my mind. It's not broken. It doesn't have to be fixed, but revision is where I feel I am the most capable in showing what I write. Anybody can draft a poem. Anybody can draft a short story. Doesn't mean it's good. To make it good is sweat equity. And when we show different ways, when these books have different writers talking about the process, because one person might have to sit down at 5 o'clock in the morning with a cup of coffee for 2 hours before they go into their day. And some people are like me, who I just saw, colleague Sean Thomas Doherty said on Twitter, does anybody else write on scraps of paper? Everything of mine is like on a bank slip or an envelope, or, now that I have my phone, it's in, there's like little scraps of paper everywhere that eventually come into the work. There's no one way to do anything. But when you read 4 different people who say how they write a short story or how they approach a poem, it gives a person, and either a person who's new to writing or a person who just wants to think about it. How often do you get to just sit and talk about writing unless you're hanging out with writers? But particularly for the person who it's not a career yet, or maybe it's just something that's a passion, it gives them more idea of how to get to their own voices and recognize they already have their own voice. They just have to learn more about the way we manipulate language to communicate. And that's loads of fun. Like, the revision process is terrific, and we should own it. It's the best part of writing. Let me hack it up. Let me go. Wah, wah, wah. I love what I call slash and burn. Take something I wrote and just, I don't use a red pen, but I use every other color.
We're starting to get some questions from the audience, and I'm going to start asking those to you, but I just wanted to give a little shout out to Brenda Miller's book, Braided Heart. The many of the genres that we've been talking about, poetry, fiction, short stories, novels, her book is really about writing nonfiction essays and writing essays. And so for people who are in our audience today who do that kind of writing, just make sure that you get a chance to read her work, because she's so thoughtful and compelling about how to think about what makes a really, really compelling essay. And so I wanted to make sure that we said a little bit more about that particular genre, since we've been focusing a lot on what we tend to think of as the creative fictional poetry genres. But we were talking about the craft of writing, so let me start with a question that one of our participants said to us earlier, which is, what are your strategies for making time to write when you have a really busy day job?
Ooh, can I start with that one?
Yes.
When I was coming back into writing after a 10-year silent period, I thought, first of all, I thought, oh my God, I'm too old. I'm never going to be able to do this. And I had been hearing that you've got to write every day. You're not a real writer if you don't write every day. And I've heard Cheryl Strayed say that happened to her when she was in graduate school. Some high mucky muck guy said that, and she worried about it because she couldn't do that. Given her life, she was working in grad school, had a kid, all these things that got in the way. And she thought, I can't be a writer because I can't do it that way. And he also said that his wife brought him tea in the morning and brought his mail in at lunchtime and stuff. So he had a really very particular setup. But I heard Stanley Kunitz say when he was asked, do you write every day? He says, there are people who do, I don't. I write when I have no choice but no, I don't write every day, every week, every month, or even every year. I write when I have no choice but to write, and I would sacrifice anything to do it. And once I heard that, I was fine. I've been working the gig economy for most of the last 15 years. And, I'm working on my 5th collection of poetry. I just somehow managed to get it done and tuck it away. And every so often I pull out time and say, let's look at the poem, or let's look at this group of poems and see what's happening, or let's look at this essay that I wrote that I haven't done anything with yet. And I just let it be piecemeal. It doesn't necessarily have to be in a formulaic way. If you work with that discipline well, then find a time that you just say, instead of doing something else, I'm going to do this. George Saunders says just 15 minutes a day. If you write one scene for 15 minutes a day, at the end of the year, you've got a good draft of a book. If you love it, you'll find a way to make it. But I think the best thing is to not impose false constructs on yourself. Don't go by what everybody else does. Do what feels good for you, and do it when you really want to.
Well, and again, that underscores the point, Jay, you had made earlier about directions, plural. There's so many different ways to do this. And Georgia, I think that that's such an important validation for writers and for readers. I think if you're accustomed to reading regularly and gaining the enrichment that experience provides, and that's taken from you because suddenly your schedule doesn't allow it, there's an equal sense of anxiety. I'm speaking, this is a subject that's very close to me. It's very difficult to be able to sift through all of the noise and all of the prescriptions that are handed down. And I think this is a point that we would do well to make here. The books in these series don't tell you how to do anything. They invite you to think about ways of finding pathways for you to do things on your own. And I think that one of the things that the books do well, each in their own way, is reinforce that point. We're all going to do this differently. I mean, I can't help but ask, I mean, Jay, you've written, over 30 books. We were talking before the event. You've just handed off a manuscript for your latest novel. You've written across genre, incredibly accomplished as a poet, as a novelist, as a critic. Your book, Why Poetry Matters, is absolutely phenomenal. I want to say the same thing, Georgia, about your co-authored book, Our Difficult Sunlight. I would imagine, Jay, you have a pretty particular way of going about it. And I'm sure writers are going to be interested and are going to learn from how you go about that process. Because just as you said with imitation, I think we become the writers we become not only through imitating others and finding the books that speak to us through our reading. We also become writers simply by finding out how we write. And that's equally as different for all of us. And so I'd be very interested to hear your thoughts on that too, again, because of the body of work you've been able to produce.
I get asked probably too many times, how did I manage to write so many books? And everybody's got to find his or her own way of doing it. As you were saying, there's directions. And I hate to be prescriptive. I've learned certain things. Early on as a young man, I had lunch once with John Updike, and he gave me some amazing advice. He said, Jay, if you just write 2 pages a day, at the end of the year, you'll have about, a whole book, if not 2 books, just 2 pages a day. And I've kind of followed that sort of program. Each person has their own program, but different phases in my life. There are times when I was raising 3 children and was busy as could be, and teaching endless classes and traveling and doing a million things. I edited so many books over the years, often for different reasons. Sometimes to make ends meet, sometimes because I felt like it. And so I would never suggest to anybody that they should do what I do. Things have settled down for me, whereas in the drift of the last 50 years for me has been write in the morning, teach in the afternoon. That's my general thing. In the evenings, read. That's been my basic pattern, with then interruptions from children, my wife, whatever, my friends, interruptions from illness, all the things that happen to you in the course of a life, right? But, if you just keep a general, I just keep a general pattern, write in the morning, teach in the afternoon, read in the evening, and allow for the variations in there. I mean, that's what it's been, how it's worked for me. And I love doing it. Again, if I didn't love doing it, I certainly would not recommend that anybody get into this game who doesn't really enjoy putting words together. You'd be crazy. It'd be crazy. Only if you like doing it, do it. Otherwise, you're nuts.
I had a
Sorry, go ahead,
great,
Georgia.
I just have a really cute anecdote of a woman who took a class with me years ago. She'd been writing like crazy and just decided, I'm going to take a class. I'm going to do this now. And she always wrote on legal size paper with a pencil, and she wrote prolifically. And then she took my class and said, well, I'm going to be a real writer now.
Mhm.
And so she went to a bookstore and got a hardback pretty journal and a really fancy pen, and she couldn't write for like 2 weeks. She just came in because she was so intimidated by the tool that she bought. Like, it was so important now to what she did. I said, put the journal down and save it for something else. Get your pad and pencil out. And then she started writing again. We can make it so much more intimidating than it needs to be. It's just, it's just joy. It's just joy. It's frustration. It's language. It's just what we got to do.
I had a friend once who took a whole year off because he wanted to write a novel, and he cleared the decks. He saved his money. He got himself a separate office uptown in New York, put his pens and everything, and he sat down. He wrote the first sentence of his novel, and it was such an amazing first sentence that he could never write another sentence. I can tell you, want to hear the sentence?
Yes.
The great sentence that ruined his career was, all of Malaysia was agog.
That's a great sentence.
So all of Malaysia, he couldn't think why all of Malaysia would be agog. But
It was a dark and stormy night.
No, but that, I mean, that's it's such a heartbreaking and at the same time such an instructive anecdote, because it also touches upon, I mean, you had said, Jay, you've got to love doing this, and I couldn't agree with you more. You also have to give yourself permission to play. And I think that that's one of the things, Georgia, you had talked about the mythos surrounding the writer. And, I think part of that has to do with the seriousness. And I'm not suggesting that passage I read earlier from Major's book. There's another passage that's equally charged from Jane's book that, if we have time, I'd like to share. I'm not suggesting for a moment that play is not serious, but it's play. We have to find a way, I think, to encourage in one another the opportunity to play in those ways, and to be perfectly at ease with not knowing why all of Malaysia is agog in that moment, and allowing that experience to guide us forward. And I think that's, Georgia, your anecdote about the woman who couldn't write because the tools were wrong, right? It's all about simply allowing ourselves to play. This gets back also to your comment about drafting, right? If you are comfortable, and Jay, this speaks to your process, right? If you're comfortable just doing it, right? And being at ease in the messiness and in the knowledge that it's not done right now. In fact, it's probably not going to be done for a long time yet.
Mhm.
And to know that that experience is really what the writing is,
Mhm.
I think you found your way into the art. And I think that that's when all of the work that you do, both as a writer and as a reader, comes to life. And that's when that enthusiasm comes off the page and becomes part of that conversation that you're having with that writer, whether living or no longer with us, right?
And discovery is a very important word too.
Yeah.
That, you know, you can't know too much about what you're writing while you're writing it, because I used to think that I was driving the bus. This is my big analogy I use all the time. I used to think that I was driving the bus of whatever I was writing, you know, and my passengers were my eventual readers. And then all of a sudden I had this shift in as I learned more and more about how I write and what writing takes, that I realized, oh no, the work is driving the bus. It knows where it wants to go. However, I'm sitting riding shotgun with the map, you know, and looking at all the different options so that we get the passengers where they need to go, you know. And the more I remember that I just have the map, but the work, to listen to what the work wants to be, so that if I think I'm sitting down to write a, you know, something in one particular direction in a particular form, and it just doesn't work, I have to consider whether or not it's asking to be something else, you know.
We have a lot of questions from our
Okay,
audience.
sorry.
So no, that was great. I mean, we could talk about this all day. What advice would one give to non-native English speakers who write in English?
I would say don't be discouraged, because so many of the greatest writers that we've ever had in English, I'm thinking of Vladimir Nabokov, Joseph Conrad, so many of them have been non-native speakers. And I think that if you bring the organizing syntax and vocabulary of another language to bear on English, it often creates a very fresh, original feel. And so I would say be of good courage, because you could become the next Nabokov.
Yeah, we also were saying that if you are intending an audience, and a, you know, English speaking audience, particularly an American audience, it's very good to have a circle of first readers who will look at how you're telling the story in both syntax and the language that you're using, to be able to make it flow well and not be quite so sometimes so literal. I know when I tried to bring up my Spanish, even when I was writing in Spanish in college, because I was taking a lot of Spanish then, I know that if it was very literal, you know, a literal translation. And with creative writing, you want to get to those places that stretch boundaries. So having a good reading circle that will, or, you know, a good critique workshop, a positive critique workshop. You know, there's someone that I'm working with who's also in one of my workshops, and she is Chinese, and she's writing this great memoir, but we're helping her smooth out the bumps that in English being a new language to her.
I think too, that brings up another point, and I think we're getting there too. I think it's incredibly helpful and important to develop an empathetic rapport with an editor who's also going to be able to help shepherd that work between the languages. Because, Jay, I think your point is such a good one. Don't feel as though one needs to fit those other, and it's not just the language, but those other ways of being in the world into those boxes. I mean, if there's one thing that English teaches us over and again, whether we're native speakers or non-native speakers, is that it is an incredibly promiscuous language, and it is a language of profound possibility. So push at it. See where you may be able to take it, and find that trusting group of people who will be able to help shepherd the work from that point at which you're moving literally from one language to another, to those interesting spaces between, right? The spaces that Amy Tan's talking about in her essay, Mother Tongue, for instance.
And make sure those readers understand your voice, you know, that they're not trying to make you write in a certain way, but they understand what your intention is, and it will guide you to ways to just kind of get rid of the speed bumps, I guess. And nobody can write, you know, nobody can write what you write. Nobody can write what I write but me, you know. And sometimes I compare myself, and I can't, that's a bad thing. I get in a bad head if I compare myself.
That's advice I always give to writers who send me a book and then they worry that somebody else is writing a book on the same idea. It's like, don't worry, no one can write your book.
Yeah.
Even if it's on the same subject with the same research. I want to ask another question. We were talking about the technology of writing earlier. We were talking about pens and paper and pencils and legal pads and so forth. But let's think about the technology of reading for a second. How has the experience of the pandemic so far changed writing and reading, do you think? Particularly, do you see ways in which digitally mediated communication has changed the forms adopted by writers and embraced by readers?
Well, I'll just very briefly answer, as somebody who was audiobook averse for much of his reading life. Having an opportunity to hear, not just to listen to, but to hear David Sedaris talk about reading with your eyes as opposed to reading with your ears was illuminating to me and completely changed how I approached writing. I got very comfortable with reading differently. I know this is kind of something we'd been talking about earlier in our conversation. I think that's just inevitable. You know, I mean, everybody's reading on their mobile devices when they're in the train commuting. We're surrounded by audio environments in which, if we're not hearing spoken word, right? I mean, talk radio is a huge thing. I think we're reaching a point where reading itself, I've used the word several times, but I think this is a really great way to kind of make concrete what I've been suggesting. I think we're moving toward a point, although I still fancy this a very great deal, right? And I do, because there's a tactility to it. This is a different experience to me than listening to Bono narrate his memoir. It's a very different experience than walking through the halls of an art gallery and hearing a sound installation. It's very different than reading a book that I'm annotating on my mobile device because it's really convenient to do. I think reading's changing. At the same time, much as what we saw, those of us who were in the fine arts, when Kodak began to discontinue certain photographic papers and Polaroid disappeared for a while, people brought it back because this is a different experience. And so I'm not making a value judgment at all. Boy, howdy, do I listen to a lot of audiobooks at this point. But I think each reading experience provides you with a different point of access and a different experience. And that may be something as a reader and as a writer to be attentive to, right? Because it's gonna come across differently when you're reading it on the page, right? When it's falling in your face as you're going to sleep at night, than it is if it's on your mobile device or if it's something that you're listening to.
You're also using a different part of your brain. That in the reading center in your brain, there's it's compartmentalized. So what we read on a hard copy on the page, we actually process differently than we process what's on the screen. Our eyes are more static. On the screen, it's scrolling up past us, and we're doing very little scanning. When we're working with the page, you know, we're more physically involved. And some studies have shown that the rate of retention from hard copy is higher than reading on the screen. The other thing that's happened that I've been really obsessed with lately is the fact that we've lost the tactile relationship with our own work. We don't put a sheet of paper in the roller and listen to the sound of the roller and feel the keys and listen to the keys and push the carriage and listen for the ding and count out spaces. It's all, we don't even send it in an, we don't even print it and pay for a stamp anymore. It's all in the ethers, unless you're a maniac like me and you print everything while you're working on it. But we've lost this tactile relationship. And I would like people to have to work on typewriters again for a little while. And just slow down. There's this urgency to get published. There's urgency for people to answer you in 2 weeks about whether or not they're going to accept your work and send it out to 15 different places. And I'm very old school because I was taught by an old school professor, Lou Turco. You do it this way, and I just can't break that habit after 50 years. I send it out one at, 5 poems go one place, 5 poems go another. They come back, they go back out. And I miss sending the envelopes. I miss getting the envelopes in the mail. I think we've lost, it's convenient and I love the convenience of it, but I miss touching work and getting a letter back from an editor,
I think too, it's important for us in our editorial roles to make this point. I think a lot of it has to do with where our readers are and how we can best reach them, right? If they're asking us to create ebooks of the books that we're publishing in these series, if that's a need, if that's how we're best going to be able to deliver this work to them, I think we have an obligation. This is true for all publishers, not just University of Michigan Press, but as readers, where are we going? And if our readership is asking us to go in different directions, I think we have an obligation to listen. And so that might be a question that, along with the answers that you're hearing from us now, I would suggest that would be a question we would ask back, right? Where do you want us to go in terms of being able to provide you with the content? What formats are you interested in exploring, and how can we build those bridges?
Derek, you've given me a really great segue to our next question, which is, this week is University Press Week, is established by President Carter. In a New York Times op-ed yesterday, Margaret Renke wrote that, quote, "University presses are especially important now for filling in the gaps left by consolidation at the big trade houses," unquote.
Yeah.
How are you all feeling about the publishing industry today? What encourages you? What worries you? And where do university presses fit in? And Jay, I kind of want to start with you. You've been with us a long time at the University Press, and you have a lot of experience across the broad publishing industry.
Yeah, well, most of my major books I published was sort of Random House from the beginning. And I really feel sad that places that Random House, there's only 6 publishers left in the commercial world. They've all absorbed all the little ones. There used to be Athenaeum and all these different little houses, and they were all gobbled up, and they're now imprints of the big 6 presses that own everything. Is really probably only 3. And so university presses and small presses are playing a huge new role in finding new voices, new outlets for short stories, poetry, creative essays, good writing of all kinds, memoirs. I think the future of publishing, frankly, lies in small presses and university presses. I think this is where it's going. This is where the good writing will happen. And so increasingly the big 6 publishing houses, Simon & Schuster, Viking, whatever, will just be publishing bestsellers and golfing books, how to improve your golf swing, or cookbooks.
Yeah, right, cookbooks.
And so literature and good memoirs and real writing of any kind will probably migrate to university presses and smaller presses. And I think one of the good things, I'm seeing a lot of new smaller presses rising up, and there's great stuff there. And even the rise of self-publishing is I think, an important, it's taking us back to the 19th century. Right. Whitman published Leaves of Grass himself. And I think that, this is where publishing began, and it will circle back. I wouldn't be surprised in 10, 20 years, the landscape looks dramatically different.
It's kind of like what happened to the music industry in the 90s. well, you know, they're the same thing. The labels were being gobbled up by the big conglomerates
Mhm.
and putting the small labels out of press, and it was hard, or, you know, out of business, and it was harder and harder and harder to get a record contract.
Mhm.
So artists started making labels,
Yeah.
or putting their own work out. And now, who owns the small presses? Almost all small presses are started by writers.
Mhm.
University presses are often staffed by writers, you know, and I think one of the things that seems to be happening as far as academic publishing is the push towards ebooks rather than the cost of print. But
Right, that's probably going to happen for academic writing. It'll go
yeah,
toward ebooks because, you know, you can't publish in the quantity. You would need to make it profitable to
yeah.
publish a monograph in some small discipline.
And the self-publishing piece, I think, you know, that used to be, oh, if anybody ever caught you printing your own book, it was a big no-no and everything. But it is, there's a lot of people who would like to just write a book for their family and friends.
Sure, why not?
They have that, and that gives them joy, and they should have the right. But to put it out, you know, the one thing that's happening is that's the market that Amazon gobbled up. You know, so we're making, as people self-publish, they're making Jeff Bezos even more rich. But you can still go to a local print house and have them do your book, you know. And small press is huge and becoming more and more important. And university presses are filling in that middle, have the opportunity, I think, to fill in that middle ground. That is really important, that there's an outlet for. So, and I think people are missing having books in their hand too. So people are buying books again, I believe. But independent bookstores are coming back into being, and we've had 3 open in my county in the last few years. And you know, and people, that there's just this, it's kind of like the food, you know, back to the land, back to the page.
Yeah.
And I think you're right. We'll see it different. I always feared Fahrenheit 451. And when I first saw the movie, when I was about 12, I started deciding I'd better pick a book. I'd better pick a book that I could become.
So we're just a little bit over time, but I want to end with one, and this has been such fun, but I want to end with one final question, which is, we talked earlier about how writers become writers through reading and through imitating writers that they love. And so I'd like to ask you each, who are the writers that turn you into writers?
I know for me, it was reading Gerard Manley Hopkins, who made me see what language could do, how it could explode on the page. That made me think, wow, I'd like to, and also reading Robert Frost. I think reading Robert Frost was profound for me as a teenager. So those are the early experiences.
Oh, gee, for me, being a young woman in the 70s, so certainly Sylvia Plath was a big one. But I had a friend older than me. He was wise, and I think 27 when I was 14. And he said, "There's 3 books you need to read," and they were Cat's Cradle, Slaughterhouse-Five, and Siddhartha. He said, "If you want to be a writer, read those 3 books." And they had tremendous influence in me as a teen writer, and fueled my passion. And then I, of course, had to commiserate with poor Sylvia.
I know these are always, I mean, this is, you know, what's your last meal? What book goes to the
Right.
desert
It's a
island?
little bit of a trick
Right.
question.
There's
Yeah.
such difficult questions to answer. And truthfully, you know, you probably get from all 3 of us a different answer an hour from now. I will say unhesitatingly, that Whitman's Leaves of Grass was the first book of poetry that I read as a very young man in Kalamazoo, Michigan, that set me on the path that I have been journeying since. That book, and the ways in which that book just opened up the entire possibility of poetry being both an art and a way of being in the world.
Mm.
And the lifetime spent shepherding those poems, right? Going from that 1855 edition to the 1892 edition. It's just extraordinary to think that so much time was spent. And I think one of the things about that book that will always remain dear to me, and this is something that it was an idea that Jim Longenbach was pursuing when I was still up in Syracuse. And it had everything to do with all of the messiness and all of the imperfections that writers keep in their work, not necessarily by design, but it's what elevates the rest of their work into being extraordinary in the ways that we respond to. And I think one of the things about Leaves of Grass that remains so pivotal to me, particularly in the later editions, is there are so many inconsequential poems in that book that are important precisely because they give space, they aerate those poems that we know and can recite by heart. They exist alongside them. They don't just prop them up. They're not just there as furniture music, as Eric Satie would say, right? They're there as integral parts of that body of work. And that book to me remains a very difficult, troubling, promising pain to the American experience in all of the ways in which each of us attempts to reconcile ourselves to and to make something out of together in a shared and important way.
I want to thank all of you so much for coming, our guests, and Jay, Georgia, and Derek. Thank you so much for this incredible conversation. I can't wait for our next episode. I hope everyone will follow us on our social media channels. I think we have a slide for that. And I'm just really excited to see where these series take us and what new books we have coming forward.
And thanks to the people who came this evening.
Thank you all.
We really appreciate your time and attention.
And let us know what books we should be publishing. Put us in touch with the writers that we're not in touch with already, so that we can give them the space that their work deserves, and we can build that discussion together and make those conversations happen.
Take advantage of that discount, 40% off. Wow, what an honor! Thank you.
Thank
you all.
you.